This lecture is going to be about the diencephalon, certainly focusing on humans, but then looking at other vertebrates as well. It is meant to be an overview. I'm designing it for students who are studying comparative vertebrate anatomy. And so I have other lectures based for students studying human anatomy and physiology, which go through this in a little more detail. And obviously the videos in the background go through a bit more detail. So this is more of an overview with that emphasis. When the human brain develops in embryos, first thing that it does is it forms three sections: the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, the rhombencephalon. And this anterior section, the prosencephalon, this then splits into two: the cerebrum, or telencephalon, but then also a second region, the diencephalon, which is the topic of this discussion. The diencephalon thus is a part of the embryonic forebrain here in green. So the telencephalon, which will form the cerebrum here. And if you were asking, so then on the adult human brain, what are we talking about? It's something that some people have trouble relating to because the cerebrum, the other part of the forebrain, is so big that that must be removed before the diencephalon is visible. So the diencephalon is kind of right smack in the middle of the brain. When we're to look at a sagittal section, one had to remove this large cerebrum in order to see it. And there are three regions of the diencephalon that I'm going to go through. The first is the thalamus, that composes 80% of the diencephalon. Underneath that is the hypothalamus, and behind the thalamus, dorsal to it, is the pineal gland. So this area in general has so many functions. It's incredibly important. One of the ways that you might hear references to it is being part of the limbic system. The limbic system, so once again, if you were to remove the cerebrum, the limbic system is a number of regions of the brain which don't exist on the very outside the cerebral cortex, but rather deeper areas. So this would include deeper areas of the cerebrum, but then it would also include both sections of the thalamus and hypothalamus, which then contribute to what we call emotions and drives. So emotions, things like pleasure and anger, they have a center of the brain, just like there's a part of my brain that says move my hand this way, and if I have a stroke that affects this, then I can't move my hand this way, or I have an abnormality with moving my arm that way. The same would then be true of emotions and drives, and the thalamus and hypothalamus, contribute to not only emotions. There's pleasure centers, anger centers, regions which will affect sexual behavior and sexual drives, but then also things like hunger and thirst and being satiated, or being cold and wanting to put on a sweater. And so a number of the nuclei for both the thalamus and hypothalamus will then have a reference to the limbic system. The thalamus makes up 80% of the diencephalon and is a good place to start. Many people underestimate the size of the thalamus, just because a very convenient place to look at the brain is a mid-sagittal section. But notice, if I were to look at a mid-sagittal section, this big green blob has to go away. That is the lateral lobe of the thalamus. So here you can see in a mid-sagittal section the diencephalon, but notice that a big portion is not in view. And so the lateral lobes of the thalamus are often then removed, and thus you get a lesser idea of the size of the thalamus. And so a mid-sagittal section would cut right through this space, the third ventricle. But the majority of the thalamus, you can see, is a lobe which is lateral to that. And so there are these lateral lobes on either side of the third ventricle. Does the thalamus cross this ventricle so that They touch. In most people, yes. And so just, there's going to be reference to a lot of smaller regions. One of the regions of the thalamus is called the paraventricular nucleus, which is exactly on either side of this third ventricle. And so the two lobes of the thalamus are lateral, but there is this intermediate mass, also known as the interthalamic adhesion, which connects the two. But in about 20 or 30% of people, it's missing. So it's a normal variant. It tends to be larger in women and more likely to be present in women, more likely to be absent in males. And so here you can see the thalamus, and here's a mass which connects the two. And so brains vary, and as we'll get to, there can even be gender variations in the brain. And the presence and size of this mass is one of those examples of what can vary. Now, I'm not going to go through it in the same degree. So here's just, here you see the thalamus, and the midbrain was just behind it. The thalamus is mostly gray matter, but there are axons, and the gray matter has soma, but there are axons forming white matter. Some of this white matter forms a capsule or an external medullary lamina around it, but then there can also be white matter inside. You can see that here, which can help to separate some of the nuclei. In this preparation, the white matter has stained black. All right, so here's that external medullary capsule here, and then you can see the dark strains here, which will help separate the thalamus into separate bands. In this animation, I kind of made that this gray color, the white matter. The white matter here can be inside the thalamus in addition to outside the thalamus. What is this white matter doing? Well, obviously, axons are coming into the thalamus, connecting it to other parts of the brain, and then leaving the thalamus. So, for example, the thalamus talks to the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. So there's a mammillothalamic tract. The thalamus connects to the basal ganglia or basal nuclei of the cerebrum. But one of the primary connections of the thalamus is to the cerebral cortex. So thalamocortical tracts connect the thalamus to the cerebrum, and the cerebrum talks back. There are corticothalamic tracts as well. So you see all this dark matter here. Once again, these are axons, and a lot of these axons are coming from the thalamus projecting to the cerebrum and vice versa. Now, something I go through in far more detail than I'm going to now is we could look at the various parts of the thalamus and ask, what do they do? The thalamus is so important, as is the hypothalamus, that we split it into separate clusters of soma or nuclei. And then I go through what all of them do. So the quick synopsis is some of these serve a limbic function, all right? And so we could name them, so whether these are dorsal or ventral, whether these are medial or lateral, that comes into some of their names. And so and each one would have then a 3-letter abbreviation. So there's an anterior nucleus, ANT, for example, and you'll see far more. But if you look, the thalamus can be split into all of these separate sections. Each one is then distinct. It gets inputs from different parts of the brain. It has outputs to different parts of the brain, and then has a different role. There can be roles in emotion, in memory, and learning. And one of the reasons that it's important to know this is then if someone were to suffer an injury, a stroke, a head injury, etc., a stroke which affects one region of the thalamus and one of the nuclei would then have a different effect than a stroke which affects a different part of the thalamus. And so there are all of these things which are coming in, what's known as attention, executive function, decision making would all then be compromised if some of these are damaged. So that's one of the roles of the thalamus, is to have a role with the emotions and drives. Second is the thalamus is an incredibly important relay information for sensory stimuli. So when we think about the cerebral cortex, this is where we're aware of something in our hand. For example, something's touching my hand. But if you look, obviously this information has to get there. All right, my brain has never seen my hand. My brain doesn't know what my knee is doing. And so therefore, if my brain is going to be aware of this, it has to then be told what's going on, with my hand, with my knee, etc. And so if you look at some of the sensory tracts which go up to the brain, some of them end in the thalamus. So here you can see the posterior column then leads to the medial lemniscus through the midbrain, which ends at the thalamus. The spinothalamic tract going through the spinal cord is so named because it starts in the spinal cord and goes to the thalamus. And then it is up then to the thalamus to have axons go to the cerebral cortex. So it's a relay, but obviously then a very important function as well. Because first off, if the cerebrum is to be aware of, hey, something's touching my hand as opposed to my knee, everything has to be kept in order. And so all of the parts of the nervous system, including then the thalamus, keep in order so that the hand stimuli are organized over here, the foot stimuli are over here. And when the thalamus then projects to the cerebral cortex then has a hand area, a foot area. And so electrical stimuli here would mean, oh, you have, something is touching your hand as opposed to your shoulder, as opposed to your knee, etc. And so that's a very important function of many of these thalamic nuclei. They are then going to the somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum, which is in the parietal lobe. And if we have a lesion here, then you may no longer be able to feel your pain. You may not, sense touch in your hand, or pain, or temperature, etc. So the thalamus is very important as a relay of sensory information. Something the thalamus helps to do, in addition to other regions like in the medulla or midbrain, is to focus our attention. Because in every single second we get, this great input of sensory information. And we have to decide, well, I can't focus my attention on all of it at the same time. I have to focus my attention. And so the thalamus, helps to relay, not just relay, but also relay the most important information. Notice that one nucleus was dealing with touch and general senses from the body. Another nucleus is getting this information from the head, and is also then receiving information about taste. All right, and so when I go through cranial nerves, I will go through the trigeminal nerve, for example, which is allowing us to feel our face. But then also when we consider our sense of taste, there are a couple of cranial nerves which participate. So most of our sense of taste is coming from the facial nerve, but the back of the tongue and bitter taste is sensed by the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then the vagus nerve also can contribute as well. So these nerves then come into the thalamus. And so the thalamus helps to relay other information as well. So there's what's known as a medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus relaying sound information. There's the lateral lateral geniculate nucleus relaying sensory information. So another big role of the thalamus is to relay sensory information coming from various parts of the body. So there's touch from the body, there's touch from the face, there's taste, there's hearing, there is vision, and so the thalamus is very important in these. Another very important aspect of another very important aspect of the thalamus is its role in motor function. Very often when we think of motor function, we don't think of the thalamus because we're thinking of the motor cortex. This motor cortex here says, all right, take a voluntary movement of your, arm. Because there's an arm area, and when you have electrical activity here, then you move your arm. That's what I think of when I think of the motor cortex. And this motor cortex then sends messages to the arm through the corticospinal tract, going from the cortex to the spinal cord. Yes, but there's more, because there's obviously involuntary centers which are contributing to movement as well. The corticospinal tract then is known as the pyramidal system, because the fiber tracts, as they go through the medulla, they form these ridges, which reminded people of pyramids. So these pyramidal ridges on the medulla that carry these tracts, this is the pyramidal system. All right, that's how we voluntarily control muscle movement, but we can do it involuntarily as well. So if someone were to slam a door, I would jerk my neck around. That was an involuntary reflex. If I decide to start walking, the decision to start walking, that was a conscious decision. But then I'm just going to keep walking while I have a conversation. I'm not going to be consciously thinking. So in addition to the voluntary centers for skeletal muscle, there's also then involuntary centers. This will include the basal nuclei of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the midbrain like the substantia nigra, but then also a nuclei in the thalamus. And the thalamus then communicates with these. And so the basal nuclei of the cerebrum, which are involved, are the basal nuclei. I should have written that instead of basal ganglia, which is also what they're known as. Not only are there separate centers, but they talk to each other. So the thalamus is, sending fibers back and forth to these other centers, but then also to the cerebral cortex. And this is helping to have control over motor function here. So that's another role of the thalamus. And there are diverse nuclei of the thalamus, which are then involved in motor function here, including the nuclei just outside the external medullary lamina. And then there's more. So the thalamus, obviously it's relaying information from the body to the cerebrum, and then from the cerebrum to the body. But it's more than that. It's helping to, coordinate and set up these higher level relays. And so not only is the cerebral cortex talking to the thalamus to send a message like to the rest of the body, a lot of these messages then go from the cortex to the thalamus to a different region of the cerebral cortex. So as different regions of the cerebral cortex then talk to each other, then there are these higher order relays as well. So here you can see the lateral lobes of the thalamus. So the midbrain can talk to the thalamus, then messages can be sent on to the cerebrum. But here you can see one lobe of the cerebrum could send a message to the thalamus, which then goes to a different lobe of the cerebrum. So once again, this is a lot, and there's a lot of subdivisions, and obviously I have this here. But once again, there can be reciprocal paths where the cerebrum is sending a message, this way from one part of cortex to the pulvinar nucleus of the thalamus to another region of the cortex, and then that region of the cortex can send a message back so that the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes can talk to each other. So this is not only a job of the thalamus, but this is the largest nucleus of the thalamus in primates. So the thalamus does so many important things. And as we ask, well, where did it come from? Just a quick word on the evolution of it. Obviously the greater details are here, is that all vertebrates have a thalamus. And if you actually then even consider invertebrates, invertebrates can actually have genes which we associate with the thalamus. So, the genes of the thalamus in humans, express these as they're forming in embryos, et cetera. And we can actually find some of them in the brain of, say, a fly. And certainly the brain of chordates has this. So here's the brain of a lancelet, here out of the lancelet's body or there. And so the diencephalon seems to even predate vertebrates. And in this diencephalon would be the thalamus as the primary region. Once we get into the vertebrates, even the simplest vertebrates, the jawless fish, have not only a diencephalon, but then they have separate regions of the diencephalon, a thalamus and a hypothalamus and a pineal gland. And then within the thalamus, there are separate nuclei. And so if you were interested in the evolutionary history of this, you could then go, from the vertebrates to the jawed vertebrates, to the bony vertebrates, to the tetrapods on land, to the amniotes, including the reptiles, to the mammals, to the primates, et cetera. And then what we would see is a gradual progression of those nuclei of the thalamus, going from just, like one thalamic mass, or like a dorsal thalamus and a ventral thalamus, into now greater subdivisions. Those connections, which I, mentioned, they didn't all appear at once. So some of the connections would be homologous when you look at, say, a shark. Other connections would then, be shared among, tetrapods. Tetrapods now having arms and legs, they have to coordinate them in a new way. So let me just get to this one image. As you look at, the subdivisions of the thalamic nuclei. Notice that amniotes have a lot more features of the thalamus that they share among themselves, reptiles, birds, and mammals, that amphibians lack. And then when you go to the mammals, so many more. And so the thalamus in early mammals changed in a number of ways, which is retained in lots of, in mammals today. So that's the thalamus. Underneath the thalamus is a second region of the diencephalon known as the hypothalamus. Now, it's smaller than the thalamus, but that doesn't mean that trying to cover it would require any less time. In fact, I would argue that this structure, which is about the size of a thumbnail in the human brain underneath the thalamus, I would argue that no other part of the human brain has squeezed as many vital functions into an area this small. And so once again, even though this is a small structure, we'll look at all of the nuclei, which how it can be subdivided. And then you'll look at their functions and you realize this is an incredible number of vital functions coming from this small structure. Once again, these videos will go through it in much greater detail. Let me just kind of give you an overview. So here's the thalamus in light green, the fornix from the cerebrum ends there. Here's the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior, that becomes important here. Here is where the optic nerves crisscross, forming the optic chiasma. And so when you hear the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that means over the optic chiasma, et cetera. So here's the dorso-medial nucleus. So it's dorsal, but it's also in the middle. So it's medial. So they all have names. Many of these nuclei have roles in some aspect of feeding. So we obviously get hungry, we get thirsty, we become satiated where we're no longer hungry or thirsty. We release hormones which affect metabolic rate. How many calories do we go through in an hour? It varies from person to person. So one person can eat a big plate of food and lose weight, and some person could eat a tiny bit of food and gain weight because their metabolic rates are different. And so there's all of these hunger-related areas. Now, they have roles in other things as well. So I'll mention thermoregulation in a little bit, but some of these have roles in thermoregulation or sexual activity. I'll mention those in just a second. Once again, of interest because people have variations. There are strokes which damage areas, and so damage in one area of the hypothalamus could then have effects such as causing overeating because you can't feel satiated because that nucleus has been damaged. Another thing that we'll see multiple times in these next couple of videos is there's what's known as a portal system, which connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Your body only has two of these, where normally an artery comes to a tissue, there's a capillary bed, and then a vein goes back to the heart. That's how it usually works. But there are two places in the body, the liver as the big one, but here's the small one, where an artery comes to a tissue, the hypothalamus, it forms a capillary bed. And then there's a portal vein that forms, that doesn't go back to the heart, it goes to a different tissue and forms a capillary bed. And then that then goes back to the heart. That's unique, your body only has two of these. So there's a portal system connecting the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And as such, the hypothalamus can send messages to the pituitary gland. And so the hypothalamus is not just a part of the brain doing nervous tissue stuff. It's also part of the endocrine system. One can argue the major part of the endocrine system, sending hormones. Now, we'll see that a lot. But look at all of these signals coming from the hypothalamus, and a couple from the pituitary as well, which have a role in feeding or appetite or hunger. So the hypothalamus not only is having neural control over certain things, it then sends messages to the rest of the body, which then affect metabolic rate or hunger, etc. And so this is one very and when you look at them, they're huge. One of the things that the signals, I would just find this fascinating. Your hypothalamus and pituitary can make this protein called POMC. Is it a hormone? No. But it's cut into all these little pieces. Look at them all. And all of these are separate hormones, many of which are involved in some aspect of feeding or metabolism. And so one of the important roles of the hypothalamus is regulating hunger, thirst, metabolic rate. But there's more. And so here, I'd like to go through a couple of things with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the nucleus which sits over that optic chiasm. Does a couple of things, but one of the main things it does, it is your body's major timepiece. Your body knows when it's night or day, and your body changes as a result. Your body is not doing the same thing in the night and the day. You change your metabolic rate to conserve energy. You change hormone secretion patterns. Your body keeps time. These are called circadian rhythms, coming from the Latin circadium, which means about a day. So if you were to pay attention, in your sleep-wake cycle, your body's temperature, hormone secretion, hunger, etc., it follows a cycle. Now, there are different parts of your body which have this aspect where they can tell time. But obviously, if different parts of your body were keeping time differently, if this part of your body or brain thought that it was day and some other part of your body or brain thought that it was night, well, then what's the use of keeping time? Because it doesn't make sense. Everyone's on a different cycle. So at some point, you have to integrate all of these and have the master clock, which then trains the others. And so that's the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now, it would keep a circadian rhythm on its own. So even if you were in a cave deprived of light, but if you notice how close it is to the optic nerve, it is getting input from the eye. And so when it's setting your body's timepiece, it is very well aware of when it is light outside versus when it is dark outside. So this is the master clock of your body that synchronizes all of your other clocks, like the ones which we'll talk about in the pineal gland separately. So this can actually be seen in individual neurons from this area where they can have a circadian rhythm, even if just the neurons are separate in a, in a tissue culture. And so, among other things, this suprachiasmatic nucleus can change the levels of arginine vasopressin, or ADH, which go into the cerebrospinal fluid. So thus, by changing the levels of a hormone going into cerebrospinal fluid, this nucleus can then tell the entire brain what time it is and help to train that. And then this nucleus will send a nerve out to a ganglion in the neck. And then from that ganglion in the neck, a nerve goes back to the brain, specifically the pineal gland. So here's the pineal gland there. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus sends neurons which go to a ganglion in the neck, which then sends nerves back to the pineal gland. The pineal gland then puts melatonin in the blood to tell you that it's nighttime. And so your body has, diverse aspects of this clock, but the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that's the master clock. There's more. There's a lot more, and obviously this is, a quick overview. There's one nucleus called the pre-optic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which has so many roles that I actually split it into two videos. So here's the pre-optic nucleus, and so I'll talk about the median section first, etc. So important roles by responding to how much fluid you have in your body. It can decide now that you're thirsty. All right, which is obviously very important in as we maintain constant amounts of fluid in our body. That's important. This is a major sleep center. So there's a neurotransmitter called adenosine, which can build up here. And the more adenosine that builds up, the sleepier we are. And so adenosine here is what makes us sleepy. And this is then being opposed by part of what's called the reticular activating system, which then promotes wakefulness. So you have parts of your brain which promote being wakeful and alert. You have this region of the pre-optic nucleus telling you to be sleepy, and then together they manage the the sleep-awake cycle. Then some of the other aspects of this are hormones reach the brain. Some of these hormones include the sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Now, both men and women make both estrogen and testosterone, but the levels can vary. They affect the brain. The brain expresses receptors for estrogen. The brain expresses receptors for testosterone, some areas more than others. These areas would be some of the ones which have the most. And so the testosterone and estrogen go here, and they seem to affect some aspects of behavior associated with gender. Now, we can discuss humans, but obviously animal studies are very easy. And so, a lot of, these statements are, generalized, affecting, mammals or vertebrates. But in all species studied, male behaviors are regulated in the medial pre-optic nucleus. And lesions here can abolish male behavior. There are some parts of the brain which are sexually dimorphic in size, where they are just like you could look at a skeleton and say, oh, I think this is the skeleton of a man or a woman based on these features, like the way the pubic bones come together. They come together at a narrow arch, that's a male pelvis, a wider arch, that's a female pelvis. So if you look closely enough, even though the skeleton is pretty much the same, nevertheless, these minor differences could help you say, oh, that's making me think, this is a male pelvis versus a female pelvis. You can do that with the brain as well. So there's variation in the brain, but then on average, you can say, oh, this area seems to be a bit bigger in females. This area seems to be a bit bigger in males. And so you could, have a fairly accurate guess on the gender of a brain. Obviously, I'm treating gender, very basically. Gender is obviously much, more complicated as we can mention elsewhere, and there's obviously variation, between males, between females, etc. But this then, the hypothalamus seems to have that role with courtship behaviors in many animals. In around courtship, there's vocalizations. So gender and sexual behavior is something which is affected by the hypothalamus. And once again, estrogen and testosterone go to the brain, but some parts of the brain have lots of receptors, where most parts of the brain have few, if any. And so there's certainly some parts of the brain which are targets of the steroid hormones. This nucleus also then affects the onset of puberty and maternal behavior after birth. So the care that many mothers will give, and once again, easy to talk about other animals where this is easier to study. You can lesion part of the brain, and now the level of maternal care typical in a species would not be given. And so there's a number of aspects of the hypothalamus involved in here. Another big thing about the hypothalamus is thermoregulation. All right, so if you look here, we're warmer than our surroundings. Our body temperature is 100 degrees, even in February. How do we do that? Because a lot of animals can't. All right, they can't do that, and so therefore they're not warm-blooded, and they have to hibernate, or they can only live, in the tropics, etc. So how is it? Well, we have parts of the body which are thermosensitive. They respond to heat. And this then is important for a number of things, important in keeping warm, but also in promoting fevers. Most of our fevers are actually caused by our brain on purpose as a way of fighting infection. And so your hypothalamus is in charge of regulating body temperature, of causing a fever, even there's a cardiovascular center which gets inputs from the hypothalamus, which can affect heart rate. Getting back to thermoregulation, we're warm-blooded, all right, and that's something that the mammals is, one of the important features of mammals, and so thus the hypothalamus's role in saying, hey, you're too cold, and so therefore you should do things that warm you up, like shiver, like shift blood away from your skin where heat could be lost. That's important for mammals. So are other things, though. What defines mammals? Well, obviously, the production of milk from mammary glands. That's where mammals get their name. So lactation, feeding, that's certainly important here. Well, the hypothalamus controls the release of prolactin, which then controls the production of milk. So, mammals are warm-blooded. The hypothalamus is involved in that. And mammals produce milk. The hypothalamus is involved in that because there is this capillary bed in the hypothalamus, and neurons from the hypothalamus then project here, and they then release hormones into the blood, which then go through a portal vein, all right, which then go to the pituitary. So here are hypothalamic neurons releasing signals into the blood. They then go through a portal vein to the anterior pituitary, where the signals are released. So the pituitary releases prolactin, but the hypothalamus tells it when. The pituitary releases the hormones which affect the thyroid gland, which keep us warm, but the hypothalamus tells it when. The pituitary releases the hormone which affects the stress response, and which also has a feeding component, but the hypothalamus tells it when. And so when we talk about the stress response, we often talk about the HPA axis, where the hypothalamus affects the pituitary, which affects the adrenal glands. The HPA axis. And so once again, I'd like to wrap up and move on. But there are so many important areas of the hypothalamus. One last major focus, and a couple of ones might pop up at random here. So once again, thermoregulation is going to pop up. It's influenced by a couple of different hypothalamic nuclei. I think I missed one. The one I'd like to jump to in just a second is the anterior pituitary gets signals from the hypothalamus through that portal system. But there are a couple of hormones, namely ADH or vasopressin, it goes by those two names, and oxytocin, which are released from the posterior pituitary, but are made in the hypothalamus. So that'll be a very important, kind of final topic before I go to the pineal gland. Before I get there, if you were interested in the evolution of this, it's kind of like the thalamus, where the hypothalamus goes back to the first vertebrates, right? So, here we have the hypothalamus controlling so many things. This would include, gender-specific behavior, thermoregulation, the ability to produce milk. So a lot of, these you would associate with mammals or higher animals, but then you also then have blood pressure, hunger, thirst, which would are far more basic. So these are, the hypothalamus is a very old center, but obviously as we go back and look at primitive vertebrates, you're not going to see all of the sections of the human hypothalamus. So this evolved slowly over time. And so thus, while the hypothalamus of, say, jawless fish has some of the similarities and some of the same regions and functions, it doesn't have all. And when you look at then the first jawed vertebrates, you'll see a few more. All right, and so then when you look at the bony vertebrates, you'll see a few more. The vertebrates on land, you'll see a few more. The amniotes, the reptiles, birds, and mammals, you'll see a few more, etc. And you could show these similarities by the anatomical existence of different nuclei or their roles. This role of this section of the hypothalamus has a role in feeding, just like in humans, or in thermoregulation in all mammals, or in milk production in all mammals, etc. The last topic in the hypothalamus is, once again, those major hormones which are released from the hypothalamus. Now, when the hypothalamus releases them, the axons actually go to the posterior pituitary. So they're actually made in the hypothalamus and released from other parts of the body. This would include oxytocin, which is just an incredibly important hormone, especially when we think of mammals. What does it do for mammals? Well, oxytocin is the cause of orgasm. It is the signal for like social behavior. If you're, you like being with friends and people that you trust, oxytocin is a major signal being released in your brain when that happens. Oxytocin is also the signal for uterine contractions, which cause labor. And so live birth is a characteristic of the Therian mammals. Oxytocin is the signal for that. Oxytocin causes the ejection of milk and lactation. So oxytocin, incredibly important in reproductive behavior, but certainly for mammals, in live birth and lactation. Arginine vasopressin, also known as ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, certainly helps us to conserve water, And so, for example, if you drink alcohol, you may notice that you start to, urinate more a few hours later, and you might have a headache the next day. That's because alcohol will suppress ADH, and you no longer keep as much fluid in your body, and then you have a headache because you're dehydrated. But arginine vasopressin has more function, has more roles than that. I go into it in far more detail than I'm going to mention here. So let me just quickly say these are made in the hypothalamus. So oxytocin is primarily made in the paraventricular nucleus, but also a little in the supraoptic nucleus, while ADH is primarily made in the supraoptic, but also in the paraventricular nucleus. These two hormones are derived from a common ancestor. They look so much the same. They the same number of amino acids. They form a disulfide bond where they two cysteines are connected. So one ancestral gene duplicated then to make two very similar genes, and that make two very similar hormones. Once again, they are made in the hypothalamus, but then axons will project to the posterior pituitary, where they will be released into the blood, and so they can be then made here in the hypothalamus, travel to the posterior pituitary gland, and then are released into the blood here. So ADH could then cause the retention of water, or oxytocin could cause a number of changes this way. So once again, major hormones being made by the hypothalamus and then released into the blood. Arginine vasopressin, also known as the antidiuretic hormone ADH, has lots of functions. It's involved in stress responses, aggression, memory, social interaction, depression risk, parental care, pair bonding. And so these are major hormones. Fascinating, even though, when I teach about them, I'll, lead with oxytocin, and it has so many important aspects for the reproduction of mammals. But you go back to jellyfish, and jellyfish have a version of this hormone. And so before one gene split to become oxytocin and vasopressin, there was a common ancestral hormone. And so lots of animals are making this neuropeptide, which has about the same structure, has some invariant amino acids, that has diverse roles, but many of the roles involve causing muscle contractions, often affecting the urinary or reproductive systems. And so once again, although mammals have used this for very advanced pathways specific to mammals, there are versions of, this neuropeptide / hormone, which, go back to early animals. Finally, one of the fascinating things about, let's just take oxytocin, is it can be released a number of ways. So here's oxytocin. It has to be folded in order to work. But how does it get released? Well, one way is that it can be released into the blood, where it's obviously functioning as a hormone. All right, so a neuron, a soma makes it, it travels down the axon, it gets released into blood. So it is then a hormone affecting cells all throughout the body. But there's other ways, because some neurons make oxytocin, but instead of releasing it into the blood, they release it at a synapse to another neuron that they're touching. So that's not a hormone, that's a neurotransmitter or a neuropeptide, which is involved in interneuronal signaling. That's a second different way of communication. But there's more, because when you look at the structure of a neuron, obviously there's the soma, and you have these dendrites coming off of it. There, it's not as common, but there is some signaling which it goes the opposite way. So instead of this way down the axon to the synapse, a neuron can actually release signals which go from the soma and affect the previous cell. And so oxytocin can function this way, where the soma and dendrites can actually make oxytocin, which can affect the previous cell, the presynaptic cell, or even the cell that's making it. And then finally, the supraoptic nucleus can make oxytocin that goes into the cerebrospinal fluid. Once it goes in the cerebrospinal fluid, I'm sorry, the paraventricular nucleus can make that as well, then it can now travel throughout the brain and affect neurons. And these are different. And so if you're looking at, when blood levels of oxytocin go up or go down, is the level in the cerebrospinal fluid going up and down by the same amount? No. So not only are there different, possibilities of spreading oxytocin, but they are regulated differently and apparently in different scenarios. So, fascinating. So the hypothalamus, the size of your thumbnail, you could argue that nowhere else in the body have as many vital functions been squeezed into such a small area. Finally, the third region of the diencephalon is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland's major role is to help with that circadian rhythm of the sleep, of the light dark cycle. So that's important for us, but it's important for lots of animals. Most mammals are actually nocturnal. Fish not only need to know light and dark as far as day and night, but that also helps them know depth. All right, so how deep are they? A lot of animals at a certain time of the year, it's time to migrate or it's time for courtship, et cetera. So they need to know what time of the year it is. So the ability to tell time is vital in biology. And in the brain, the diencephalon, there is a part known as the pineal gland. So if this is the diencephalon, here the thalamus is brown, the hypothalamus is green, the pineal gland is here. Here is the thalamus, here's the hypothalamus in the human brain, there is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important because it will convert an external signal, which is light. So is it light? Is it dark? How long is the day? That's an external signal. It then converts it to an internal signal throughout the body, the presence of melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone released from the pineal gland. And once again, when we study the endocrine system, a lot of people think, oh, we'll talk about the thyroid gland, we'll talk about the thymus gland or this. Well, you actually start with the brain. The hypothalamus, the pineal gland, they are parts of the brain and thus parts of the nervous system, but part of the endocrine system as well. This melatonin comes from the amino acid tryptophan, which we can get in our diet. So we eat, tryptophan as one of the amino acids, and then we can change it. All right, an intermediate, we can change it into serotonin, and then you can change it from there into melatonin. And the neurons which do this are making the appropriate enzymes which perform specific steps in this pathway to take this precursor and then change it into the next the molecule. So melatonin being released from the pineal gland can then be a signal which goes all throughout the body and tells the organs of the body that it is light, it is dark, etc. So once again, an external signal has been converted to an internal signal. In some of these images of the pineal gland, you'll see some black lines. Those are blood vessels. And so the pineal gland is rich in blood vessels. So melatonin is being produced. This is not new. All right. So when we look at the brains of other vertebrates, there are pineal structures in the diencephalon of fish, of tetrapods, of amniotes, etc. Now, the fascinating thing about, well, actually, forgive me, I'll get into that in a, well, there are specialized neurons in the pineal glands. They have a modified cilium, which can actually detect light. Now you may say, wait a minute, that's what the eye does, that cells, the rods and the cones. That's a neuron-derived cell, which has a specialized cilium which detects light. So these are called pineal sites. So here's a rod here. It's detecting light. And so pineal sites also have this modified cilium, which is capable of detecting light. Now, mammals have lost that ability. So they still have pineal sites. They no longer detect light directly. But as I'll mention, the pineal gland and pineal body often referred to as, quote, the third eye, all right? How do we detect light? Well, we have these eyes. But the fish, especially ancestrally, the earliest fish, the earliest amphibians, the earliest reptiles, look at their parietal bones. There's a hole. There's a hole called the pineal foramen. All right. And then actually, I mean, even the ancestors of mammals had it. Light would actually come in the top of the head and hit the pineal gland, which was sitting right there. So the pineal gland was made originally to detect light. All right. Being just underneath the parietal bones, there was an opening that would let light in. And then based on the light which came in, then it would send signals about light, dark that would help these biological rhythms. Now, in mammals, there are still mammals which have what's called midbrain exposure, so that the midbrain and the pineal gland are exposed at the dorsal surface of the brain. Here's a bat which has an abnormally large pineal gland. Most mammals, however, have seen this great expansion of the cerebral cortex, the neocortex, which then covers the pineal gland. So in most mammals, here's in humans, obviously, here's what's right underneath, the parietal bones, not this. And so as the cerebrum got bigger, it covered the pineal gland, which was now no longer able to detect light directly. And so now light impulses reach the pineal gland indirectly through the hypothalamus here. So if you remember, the suprachiasmatic nucleus gets input from the eyes and then sends input to the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is still being told when it is day versus night, but it no longer is detecting light directly. In many vertebrates, the pineal gland expresses opsins, which are detecting light. That's no longer the case in humans because we don't have an exposed pineal gland on the dorsal surface of the brain. So the pineal gland makes melatonin from its pineal sites, and this then can be released into blood. So the pineal sites in mammals release melatonin just like all of these other ones. So you can see that this is an ancient mechanism. Melatonin, is sometimes called the hormone of darkness because we make it when it's dark. So here's the pineal gland, and at night then it's making melatonin. It puts it into blood vessels, and here are these dark staining lines. You can see these are blood vessels in the pineal gland here. And so then thus your body is told about light versus dark. But it's so much more than that because melatonin has other roles. Melatonin is an antioxidant. That's important for lots of things like decreasing heart disease risk, asthma risk. Melatonin is anti-inflammatory. Melatonin removes reactive molecules. Melatonin will stimulate the immune system. So, I'm sure our parents, told us, get a good night's sleep, etc. One of the reasons so many good things happen when we are asleep. And so melatonin is one of the reasons for that. Melatonin has so many beneficial effects. Melatonin affects the reproductive system, which obviously has a timing component to it. When does puberty begin? All right, the menstrual cycle is obviously a cycle. Melatonin actually helps to protect from cancer. It's anti-proliferative. So melatonin is quite complex. It varies. It varies at different times of the year based on how much light versus dark there is. And melatonin is used to, treat various disorders. So the pineal gland's melatonin, it is used for um, in training the circadian rhythms, but there's so much more than that. It's protective of the body, protecting from cancer, heart disease. It promotes a healthy immune function. And if you're not making enough melatonin, this could come from not getting enough sleep. There could then be a lot of consequences to this. This is especially concerning because we limit darkness. All right, it used to be that when the sun went down, it was dark, you went to sleep. There were very few other options. But now there is more light. So your brain is exposed to more light. You can be active at night. You can get less sleep. This affects the amount of melatonin that you make. And this then has lots of different consequences in the body. And so the pineal gland is part of the brain's diencephalon. It makes the hormone melatonin, which is so very important. And this has, a fascinating evolutionary history, and being quite old. All right, and so circadian rhythms go back to invertebrates. Invertebrates have circadian rhythms. Invertebrates can use melatonin in their circadian rhythms. Melatonin even affects plant germination, root development. So this is a very old signal. And so melatonin is simply fascinating. And the first cells to detect light were the brain. Before there was a prominent eye in the vertebrate, in the chordate lineage. The brain detected light. Now, part of the brain then pushed forward and became the retina. But then part of the brain, the pineal gland, then remained detecting light. And so, talking about these pineal sites, they clearly have, a relationship to the cells of the eye, which detect light, like this rod here, both using these specialized cilia, which then which then detects light because it expresses opsin. You might say, well, the eye doesn't make melatonin. It actually does. It just doesn't function as a circulating hormone. It acts as a local signal. And so, the history of the pineal gland is actually linked to the history of the eye and that detection of vision. Now you might say, oh, wait a minute, how can that be? Because the eye's over here is not part of the brain. Technically it is, because technically what happens is this is the optic cup in a developing pig embryo. It's connected to the brain. See that? All right. This then just lengthens to form the optic nerve. Now, technically the optic nerve isn't a nerve, because a nerve is something that leaves the brain. The retina is technically part of the brain. It's just a part of the brain which then moved away from the rest of it. And so what we call the optic nerve is better perhaps described as the optic tract. So here you can see what's in a pig brain, what will be the retina is actually part of the brain. All right, it will just then move from it. And I just say that it was the brain that started detecting light using these cells, and then the ones which ended up in the retina became specialized in rods and cones. But the pineal body then made these as well. And so thus the early vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, they were using the top of their head to have light come in, and their brain was detecting light and processing light. Mammals then made a sacrifice. They lost that ability because they gained then a cerebrum, which got so big that it stretched over the pineal gland here in the sheep. It's no longer exposed at the surface of the brain. And so you can see then the mammalian pinealocyte no longer makes opsins and no longer functions as a, quote, third eye. This, quote, third eye was never for vision, just detecting light. So our pinealocytes no longer have that ancestral function, because once again, the fish had this opening here between the parietal bones. So did the first amphibians, so did the first reptiles, so did the reptiles which were the ancestors of mammals like the pelycosaurs and the therapsids. But in the therapsid lineage, by the time we get to cynodonts, the pineal gland is closing. So here you can see a therapsid. It still has a pineal foramen. Here, this opening the parietal bones. But by the time we get to cynodont reptiles, then it is lost. This is more prominent in others. So many modern vertebrates are still using their pineal glands to detect light, such as lizards. So there you could actually see, here's the opening at the top of the head where light comes in and stimulates the pineal gland. There are some fish, which even though they don't do this as adults, they as larvae are using their pineal glands to detect light. So if you were to take a brain and take away the cerebrum, this exposes then the diencephalon, also part derived from the embryonic forebrain. You know, here we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the pineal gland. So important that, you know, we split it into all of these separate nuclei that, you know, cover all of these vital functions. And not only is it critical in the nervous system, but as you could see, an incredible number of hormones come from the hypothalamus and melatonin from the pineal gland. You know, thus the diencephalon of the brain, also a critical part of the endocrine system. So this has been an overview of that. And as you can see, the videos of this playlist will go through this in a little more detail.